Okay, we're gonna start kicking things off here. We're just running into one issue for anybody that's online, where the camera, where Tim, our presenter, is off camera, but the slide deck, and hopefully if you can hear me, you'll be able to hear him. As you have questions, let's see what we got. Please post them in the chat. I'm watching them on a separate laptop off screen. Can you see what, do you see anything in the chat there? The chat, I think, was my comment. If somebody posted something in Q&A. Okay, cool. So we'll start kicking things off, and I'll be off screen monitoring anything that's posted in chat. I'd kind of like to, I do just a couple minutes of house cleaning for everybody here, and then I'd love to have you guys, the presenters, come up and just let you each introduce yourself. Next meeting is on the calendar for anybody that's available, interested. It'll be online and on site here as well. It'll be Justine Phillips and Matt Stamper speaking, and they'll be talking, kind of pulling off from their data privacy book and what they also learned at being a Black Hat last week. So we've got that event coming up in October. The event will be here as well. It'll be a collaborative ISSA San Diego, ISC Squared San Diego, Women in Cybersecurity San Diego, and ISACA San Diego event. Probably going to try and do something with the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence San Diego as well, to tap into them for some presenting presenters. We don't have a specific topic, but we are confirmed for all of that. If anybody's interested, I should share with everybody that on behalf of the chapter, we're starting to do some additional webinars. They're not necessarily ISACA, just us as members kind of things. They're really community-based webinars where we're trying to have different people speak on different topics, and anybody's invited to them. A lot of them are on general information security awareness types of things. The first one that we have will be next Tuesday. It's on the calendar. These are free for anybody to attend, and we'll be touching on, it's myself and an insurance broker, where we're talking about what small, mid-sized businesses need to be aware of, what insurance companies are looking for, and I'm going through just the baseline security recommendations that that are advised that insurance companies are looking for. So if you know anybody that's interested, you know, they're available, they're free, they're open to the public. And that's really what I've got for news on this. If anybody's got any questions or anything, want to make all of this just totally informal, open, raise your hand or just speak. And if you guys wouldn't mind coming up, just like let you introduce yourselves. Our presenters this month are Kiteworks, have been kind enough to come down, talk. That's why you've got some of the literature and stuff at the table there. And Tim will be doing the presentation, but microphone's right here. So
okay, that's fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Kasnar. Excuse me. I'm the regional sales director here for Kiteworks in the SoCal region, and covering most of California. So very excited to have this presentation for you guys, and we appreciate the time and people showing up on Zoom and being here live in person.
Awesome.
Olga, would you like to say hi?
Hi, I'm Olga Gonzalez. I'm with Kiteworks as well. I'm the Field and Channel Marketing Manager. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Olga.
Oh,
Everything working?
okay. Take a look. Okay, Neil just shared that it sounds like chat's disabled. So I'll go take a look at that. And at the same time, I'll hand it over to Tim.
Okay.
Here, let you introduce yourself and take it from here. Thanks. What's that?
Q&A should be working.
Okay, well then we'll use that.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good.
Good, man.
Yeah, listen, I appreciate the invite. This is our first opportunity to speak at a ISACA meetup, I guess you would call this. So really appreciate it. I'm actually not Tim Freestone, the CMO. I'm his deep fake. So Tim Freestone is in a beach in Bali. Wouldn't that be great if at some point we had deep fakes that just went to work and we just sat on a beach? I look forward to that day.
I think some governments have that.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen the movie show Severance. That's like the ideal state, I think. But anyway, I'm here. I enjoy it. I'm just kidding. So I'm with a company called Kiteworks. We're out of the Bay Area. We're out of San Mateo now. We're a global company. We offer a solution that we call the private content network, which I'll get to. But most of this conversation is sort of high level thought leadership on kind of some of the trends that we see in the market. And, like Dave said, try to keep this as informal as possible conversation. However we want to take it is fine with me. I can tell you what we took back from Black Hat: AI. That's it. That's the only thing we got out of Black Hat. So I will talk a little bit about that in this presentation. But no presentation is good without a timeline. So I'll just do a little memory lane here because I think it gives us a sense of what kind of era we're in. And if we look at the differences between the IT security maturity and the cybersecurity maturity, they kind of went through different eras throughout time. So if we think way back, late 70s, we had the mainframes that came in, and all of IT was essentially, and is still essentially, to enable business through innovation, right? Mainframe being the first thing that hit the business environment. Following mainframe, the first thing to hit from a cybersecurity standpoint was they had to put passwords in place, right? And bonus points if anybody knows what the most common mainframe era password was.
Password.
No, it's admin. So that's high security, right? Yeah. But I mean, obviously what happened is that businesses started to see the power of computing, and we moved into the personal computing era. Then we had, for cybersecurity, the ARPANET, and we saw the first worm introduced. Anybody know what the first worm was?
Wasn't it Catch Me If You Can?
Yeah, the Morris worm, and all it did was say, "Catch me if you can," right? But that was cybersecurity at its height, or threats at its height. Then we moved into the client server era. Again, the whole point of this sort of evolution here is that we've got two trajectories kind of operating in silos. And the IT infrastructure is about driving business, and cybersecurity is about protecting the drivers from business from threats. And the whole time, all the threats are evolving. And you get through the internet protocols era and you start to see malware. The first security paper is written, white paper. Security departments start to form. You get into enterprise computing, you start to see viruses. And really up until viruses, it's all been about sort of destruction, not necessarily theft. Not really until the hacker era, and you get into enterprise computing, where the computation goes out to wide area networks, and hackers start not just trying to bring down companies, but they do it for money, right? So it's about ransom, it's about stealing actual money. And then you get into the cloud era, and now we have advanced persistent threats. And as my chief product officer likes to say, you can pretty much just bank that there's an advanced persistent threat in your company today. So by and large, for the most part, these two organizations have operated somewhat in silos and moving through. But what's happened over the last 5 years, maybe 10, is there's a convergence of these into what we call the compliance era. So if you think about companies are really trying to manage risk to mitigate financial risk, and financial risk for the longest time was, hackers and ransom, hackers stealing your IP or stealing actual money. But now with the compliance era, companies have to really start thinking about fines. So these two entities have started to come together with a shared responsibility about maintaining compliance. So we believe we're fully in the compliance era, and it's only going to get worse. So a couple of data points behind this. This is from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Right now, there are 71 countries with compliance legislation globally. 9 countries with draft legislation. So not almost 80% have legislation that global organizations need to follow when doing business with these countries. 15% with no legislation. I love this last one. I actually just noticed this morning. There are 5% of countries with no data.
Do you know who those?
No, I do. I was going to look it up later, but I just have this envision this like people going to the restaurant with like gold doubloons and abacus, and it's just like no data in these countries. But the point of it is, when you're looking at globally, 80% of the countries having some sort of legislation, and if you're a global entity, you have to deal with that. Gets even worse. We ran out of slide space, but federal compliance regulations, all the way back to 2001 with the US Patriot Act. For financial institutions, you got the GLBA, HIPAA, FERPA, FISMA. Obviously there's a ton here that everyone has to deal with. PCI, that pretty much drove the web application security industry into what it is today. And then now if you're a manufacturer and you're doing business with the federal government, which most all manufacturers are doing, to worry about CMMC and CMMC 2.0. And again, this is just I ran out of slide space here, but you get the point. If you're looking at 80% of the globe having regulations in countries, our own country having hundreds, these are obviously some of the big ones you need to think about, but now we're starting to get into the states. So global, federal, state regulations. Again, this is all within the last 15 or so years. Right now, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Virginia, and Utah all have privacy regulations in place that companies have to abide by. Again, otherwise you could get fined. And most all other states have something in legislation. So you can think about, what is being asked of cybersecurity and IT infrastructure organizations today. Yeah, it's protect our company jewels, but now it's also figure out this complexity of global, federal, and state privacy regulations and make sure we don't get fined by any of them. So it's incredibly complex. And that's why you start to see a lot of these industries pop up like GRC and other solution providers. But it doesn't just stop at facts like this. IDG, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, recently did a survey where the priority for budget security spending is. And I don't really understand number one, because who wouldn't put best practices as a priority? But if you ignore that one, right at the top is compliance regulations, is essentially tied for one with the arbitrary best practices. So, and that's new. You can go back on these surveys several years and just see it kind of moving to the top. Obviously, it's because of all the complexity behind it and the fact that they need to protect the organization from fines. Any questions about that?
Just if you go back,
Sure.
it looks like 39%, the bottom two added up, are just completely reactionary. It's
Yeah.
partner mandated it, or they're responding to an incident that happened with the partner.
You could even take it to the mandates from the board of directors at 22. It's still, kind of reactionary, right?
Yeah.
But it's crazy that, compliance is becoming such a consideration, but we know why, because of what I just showed you. Yeah.
So I would bet that under best practice is actually most people responding to events thinking that is best practice. Because I can tell you when I'm dealing with customers, trying to get them interested in doing things that they really should.
Yeah.
I have never made a sale based off best practice, ever. And I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years plus.
Mhm.
I mean, it's always in response, even if you're going to implement best practice, it's in response.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes into compliance. So,
No, I agree. I mean, look, you could probably bucket all this in the response and compliance. Absolutely. If the regulation didn't exist, people wouldn't be making purchasing decisions without it, right?
most companies, they really impact them.
Yeah.
I've literally been told GDPR won't impact us because that's data.
Interesting.
I mean, to determine, when you're determining spending best practice, I see it being top, because to be honest, unless you're in a regulated industry, best practice is the only thing you got to go on.
Sure.
So that's what's going to determine what you spend money.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is that, and I love the statement because it's that unless you're in a regulated industry, because all these regulations are coming out, it's almost like every company's in a regulated industry now, right? Now,
Privacy does that.
Yeah.
For everybody.
Yeah. I mean, granted, there's like highly regulated, not as highly financial services, things like that, but we have customers across all industries now. And they're all purchasing us for compliance reasons, and security, of course, but
Yeah, and where we work, we do some vendor risk management. So you'll have, like, the Department of Labor came out saying, if you are a trust fund for something, like for a union, you have to assess all of your vendors that have access to the fund's data in any capacity.
Yep.
So even if you had an organization previously that didn't fall under a regulation umbrella, this is coming out because it isn't just what is the fund doing, it's what is all.
I just finished something that Ian was training in, and it's trade compliance.
trade compliance.
Trade
Yeah.
You are responsible for everybody that your product touches, no matter secondary, tertiary,
Yeah.
or downstream. And again, as much as this is a nice slide, I would just come back and say, especially the first one, best practices, what the hell are best practices?
Yeah.
And how much money do I have to spend?
Yeah. And when you say trade, this information supply chain that we're now in right now, whenever someone says, historically, you say supply chain and the mind goes applications, software, but there's a whole dearth of data supply chain, just your data moving throughout your third party. And I'll get to a few slides on that. You might have teed me up for that, but that's one of the considerations now. And it really what's driving it. Well, you can't see my titles. Let me see if I can move this up. Success-ish. Okay, so data is at the center of compliance. And so one of the things I didn't mention is when you went through that ecosystem of evolution of infrastructure and cybersecurity historically has been protecting the infrastructure, network security, web application security, data center security. All of that, of course, is to protect the data. But now, because of compliance regulations, there's this layer of like, well, what do we do at the data layer, right? And it gets really complex with compliance because you're talking about ultimately three types of data sets. You got structured data, databases, semi-structured data, logs and emails, and unstructured data. And across all of these, you've got all the P's and the I's, the PII, PHI, IP. I mean, if you're doing business with the government, you got CUI and FCI, there's CJI. it just, there's more and more. We have another slide that or 4 or 5 slides that just lists all the I's. I throw this up because you'll get it. But all the different types of data sets and all the different types of private information that needs to be protected is really what's at the center of compliance. Very few, although you guys could challenge me on this, compliance regulations are telling you to do something with your network. They're telling you to protect your data, right? So when you think about it in that context, it becomes really, really important to then think about how complex this is, because compliance requirements are asking IT and security teams to not only protect it, but track it and control it. So you have 3 dimensions on top of 3 dimensions of data set types and 20 different dimensions of private information that all these compliance regulations are asking you to keep track of. And it's one of those things, well, we could stick our head in the sand because it's so complex, but obviously we believe there's solutions to that. But it gets even more complex, to your point, Dave, which is when the data starts to move. And the true complexity is on these 2 subsets, because databases, they do move, but it's less likely you're going to lose an entire database as it moves. But semi-structured data and unstructured data is the Wild West. That stuff is, no one has control over that stuff right now. And regulators don't care that it's semi-structured or unstructured or in a database. They just don't care. So there is a requirement that even though this is incredibly difficult and everything's on the move, you got to pay attention to it. So rather than, from our company perspective, talking about semi-structured and unstructured, we just lump it into the phrase of content. Content, because files doesn't really do it justice, because there's a lot of semi-structured data that isn't in file format. So those 2 things that are really complex, we bucket into content. So data on the move. And where it's hard enough that this stuff is moving within your organization, but when it's moving into third parties, it's, again, it's one of those, we can't really do much about it, sort of a sentiment right now. But that third party ecosystem, I'll get to a couple of slides in a moment, is growing and growing and growing. Your data is moving more and more, faster and faster, and the regulators are going to start coming more and more to your door and asking you to redact certain PII, to tell you where the PII went, or have you tell them. And a shoulder shrug just doesn't do it anymore. I'll pause there. Does it make sense?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Actually makes me nervous every time I go through it.
What I'm seeing in some certification areas, they're coming into standard government terms, they're coming into prime. And the rest of the prime. So how does your 5th generation subcontractor who's making this kind of a nut see it full compliance?
Yep.
Prove it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's super strong in CMMC 2.0.
Absolutely.
That
And HIPAA.
yeah. I mean, it's with any regulation set, there's the ones that really mean business and the ones that are like checking the box. But there's this, CMMC is going to start laying down, I think, in the next couple months, the actual rule. They keep saying that. I know you said it.
The rule's out.
Is it?
The rule is over at OMB.
Office, yeah.
Regulatory assessment.
Yeah.
Expected 60 days, then it hits Federal Register, which can be anywhere from 3 days to 21 days. Then how it comes out, it's either a rule or a kind of a rule. But in parallel, this 171 referees coming out at the time.
Yeah. And the key here is what is going to be the stick behind this? Like, what happens if you don't, and we know we're going to lose contracts. Like you're going to lose your contract with the government, but there could be other sticks that go behind it. But I just think CMMC is going to be the driver behind everybody waking up, at least in manufacturing.
Don't discount HIPAA. I mean, in my view, they're equivalent in terms of that level of concern. Because the HIPAA now you go not just with the hospital, but the manufacturers of the equipment.
Oh, I see, yeah,
And then there's some manufacturers, et cetera. So there's in my view, there's a parallelism. And HIPAA is great for getting you with money.
sure. Yeah,
I get what you're saying, that, you know, whoever's bound by HIPAA is now being bound by their.
That's right.
yeah.
Got it, okay. Yeah.
You know, we see that we have customers, healthcare customers, and manufacturers with imaging, like healthcare imaging. Because first of all, images are super large files, so you need a technically robust system. But the amount of PHI that's in those things is obvious. We have a no, this is the new one. So we do every year a survey of the industry just to kind of get a sense of how big of an issue this is, and each year it gets worse and worse. So a couple of the takeaways from our report. One is that 75% of the organizations indicate their measurement and management of the sensitive content needs improvement, and 62% experience financial damage as a result of an attack on sensitive content. If you're interested at Kiteworks, you can get the full 42-page report of data statistics, but net is each year these numbers are growing and it's getting worse, and compliance is definitely driving this. And then recently from Gartner, again, back to moving the security profile from how do we guard our network, how do we guard our applications, how do we guard our cloud, to the data layer. So they say that data-centric security will be a key to a data everywhere world, which makes absolute sense. We like to make a little bit of an amendment to that data-centric compliance will be the key to a data everywhere world, in addition to security. Security and compliance cannot be untethered right now. And so whenever you talk about one, you have to talk about the other, because the ultimate goal of both security and compliance management, is to prevent your business from financial risk, right? So that they have the same objective. So now I've got 3 gaps that Kiteworks sees in tackling this risk management issue when it comes to compliance. First one is third party, which one could guess. So 10 years ago, maybe 15, though it's going all very fast, but TPRM, third party risk management, came on the scene. Companies like Risk Recon, Security Scorecard, they're blowing up right now, all to address kind of like, well, how do I protect and ensure that when my data is in the hands of this information ecosystem, I've lowered the risk as much as I can. Again, with a recent hype cycle from Gartner, one of the ones that's reaching the peak is dynamic risk governance. They indicate that supply chain and third-party risks and digital risks are starting to increase in consideration. Last year's data breach report, I haven't assessed this year's, from Verizon, put the partner ecosystem as the #1 vector for system intrusions, and system intrusion became the #1 threat type, if you will, and that's advanced participant threat. So you've got this partner ecosystem, you've got your system you need to consider, and you've got data exploding everywhere, and you've got compliance regulations on your back. So what Gartner does is they come out with an incredibly complex, not really, way to implement third-party risk management. And this is where I'll talk a little bit about the gap. So essentially, they recommend you go through a process. You got to ask, well, first, does the vendor access data? Do they access systems, et cetera? But what these companies are doing, and what Gartner shows here, is that you need to assess everything, which you do. Assess vendor controls, assess their capabilities, assess their disaster recovery, throw questionnaires at them until they get really angry, validate all their controls, comes back to your system. You analyze all the findings, you quantify the risk impacts. It's a lot of work here at the assessment stage. And then once you determine any contract implications and you decide to do business with them, go, right? So it's an assess, it's a score, and then it's a yes, do business with them. But then what? So now you're doing business with them. That company is made of people and machines. And those people change, the machines change on an ongoing basis. So there's a gap post-assessment in third-party risk management. I'll thumb through this one real quick as well, because I kind of tend to beat this horse to death, but when you look at first-party ecosystem and third-party ecosystem and sort of the NIST cybersecurity framework, historically, companies have been racking and stacking security solutions in the first-party ecosystem across the NIST cybersecurity framework. I just ran out of acronyms here. Identifying, protecting, detecting, et cetera, DOP, all that stuff. But in third-party ecosystem, as it's just evolving now, everything's launching in the identify stage of the cybersecurity framework. So GRC, governance, risk and compliance, IT vendor risk management, supply chain risk management, third-party risk management. Looks like it did ITBRM twice. It's all assessments. But what do you do once the data is in their hands? Like, how do you maintain protection, detection, response, not just in your ecosystem, but in the third-party ecosystem? And so that's where we say there's a gap. And there is a solution. It's an oldie but a goodie, but I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of this. So post-assessment with your third-party supply chain, and you're doing business with them, you still are responsible for your data. So you can do these core things: protect the interchange of the data between the third parties with encryption and digital DRM, digital rights management. Control the sharing with zero trust principles at the content layer. The next few slides, I'm going to talk about the delta between the gap of where zero trust is today and where it needs to go. And you need to unify all of your communication channels, that all of your data moves in and out of your organization into this third-party system. And then you need to track it all. That's how you lower risk in the information supply chain. Do all the assessments, pick your vendors wisely, and while you do business with them, make sure that you've got all of the data protection tools and tracking and control to ensure while you're doing business with them, you've lowered risk as much as possible. So before I go on.
Yeah, and just, well, as you say, you're gonna go on to the zero trust. There's been a couple more comments, but
Yeah.
a question and answer.
Sure.
Talking about zero trust. So when you're going there, it started how it's initially a technical framework or model. But
Yeah, and I presented this slide to Gartner, the third-party risk management analysts, and they said, yeah, but there's the assessment part is still so evolving that they just can't get past that piece.
Certainly hoping not to take away from other slides, but so when I look at this right now, your first point is closing the gap, first block being assessment. Isn't what your gap, you listen to this gap type of question that should be asked? And then it
Yeah.
becomes a win-win.
Yeah, that's another one. People do the third-party risk management assessments wrong, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. That's just people and processes that need to be managed. But I'm making the assumption that intelligent people have done the right things with third-party risk management.
I guess
Yeah.
I would just say is that we have gap and then another arrow back into your first.
Back into the first one. I could see that. Yeah. As with most new solution sets, obviously gaps emerge, but I just think this is the biggest one. I mean, it's one thing to get a score and an assessment and then you start doing business, but to turn a blind eye once you start moving your data into that system is.
That's why I refer back always to that. Once I've done it, there's observe more at the side act, I'm gonna observe again. There's another where you set the controls, set them up, establish them, get the test parameters, monitor them, and reassess.
Yeah.
So those types of things. You know, your point here, addressing it to the data, I agree, it goes down, not just, do you have something in place?
Yeah.
Personally, I think as part of the problem is too many non-IT companies, manufacturers. You're lucky they can say cybersecurity, first of all.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, but they go, well, yeah, I talked to Billy, 2 years ago. Yeah, but what has happened to Billy? Well, he's had 17 breaches, he's been fined for this, whatever. So it's that constant, and I am seeing that in this increased emphasis on this revisiting. And again, do the full reassessment. You know, getting into the deep down to avoid the farms.
Yeah, and NIST CSF is going through a revitalization right now too. So one of the things they're introducing is governance
Yes.
as a pillar, which they didn't have before. So we're all in this together, obviously, but if we recognize that compliance is a data problem, the industry, the entire global economy needs to start looking more at where their data is going. They just have to. Which leads me to the second gap. Yeah.
I think another important question you have to ask at the beginning is how difficult will it be for you to separate from that vendor once you start working?
Mhm.
If you can't separate from them, that definitely raises the risk, right? So if they suddenly have a breach and you want to switch vendors, but it's going to take you a year to get it off of them, now you're stuck with that problem for a year. So knowing how you're going to get out of the relationship before you get into it, I think is a key question to ask.
Yeah, and then think about, go ahead.
Risk inheritance.
Yeah. And think about the risk inheritance and when you stop doing business, if you don't have control over the data that they have, how are you going to get all that back? Right? It just, okay, you just stop doing business. They have 2 petabytes of your sensitive information. However much it is.
That's a real common problem.
Yeah.
I've dealt with a lot of customers. Who will have enormous amount of data with a partner. And to get it back would pretty much bankrupt the company.
Yeah.
Just because nobody looks at the idea of portability, how much will it cost me to get my data back?
Yep. And again, you can't just keep sticking your head in the sand and, you know, hoping for the best. And, you know, obviously we feel, which you'll get to my punchline eventually, there is a solution to this. It's not an overnight solution, but once people start thinking about, well, how do I control my data and essentially never lose control of it at the highest sensitivity level, there's got to be a threshold of sort of like low risk data. It's like, okay, it's low risk, you know, I'll put some protection on it, but the highest risk, especially when you start getting into IP, some of the PHI, you just can't lose control of it. And you're doing business with hundreds of vendors. So one of the solutions that we've all heard about for many years now is zero trust, which is, well, just don't trust anybody, get least privileges. And zero trust, here it is, people and infrastructure. This is where zero trust is today, people and infrastructure. Least amount of access of people to my endpoints, my applications, and my network. Okay. Well, once they're in your applications, your endpoint, your network. Again, to borrow a slide from Gartner, I think we probably all know the process of zero trust for application and network access. There's authentication, there's risk calculation, all of this stuff. And then that goes through a gateway to say yes or no, allow this person access to the application, right? Or to the network or to the cloud workload. But once that person's in that infrastructure, they're in the infrastructure, they have access to the data. So the zero trust has to extend to the data layer, because our question is, but what about the content that moves through and beyond these applications and into third party and other ecosystems? And so, you know, the practical ways for implementing zero trust as a best practice are, you know, obviously have a security mindset, again, the Gartner slide, replace implicit trust with adaptive trust. And they say, go for 2 projects, user to application, so ZTNA, and workload to workload segmentation, people and infrastructure. And what we say that where the gap is, well, what about people to the content itself, the assets, the data itself? Put zero trust on the assets that they have access to So you can start to segment people and content subsets based on risk profiles. Because once they're in a workload and once they're in an application, if you haven't segmented your content by sensitivity and put profiles and rules on segmentation of user content, it's kind of a free for all. So we say data-centric compliance via Zero Trust has two layers, applications and workloads layer and the content layer. That's where the gap for Zero Trust is. I'll pause there. Then I got a third gap. It's basically just saying, do the stuff with the infrastructure and the network, but bring it down one more layer to the content. And this piece of content has least privilege access. This application has least privilege access, and this network has least privilege access. So if you allow them to get in the network, you allow them to get in the application, maybe this piece of content isn't for them because it's hypersensitive. So toggling that least privilege access down to the data itself will become more and more important with the compliance era.
One thing, by the way, 100% agree. But there's one thing that people forget that is left out. And that is, it's really not people, it's identity.
Identity, yeah.
Because if you have a bot going in
Machines.
and it's going in and grabbing data from HR, it's grabbing from finance, Google, account payable, account receivable. You just watch a lot of segmentation, a lot of people.
Yeah.
And a lot of companies just worry about, carbon. They don't really care about anything that's digital.
Yeah.
And that is a huge gap.
Yeah. You're right. It's identity. People to people, machine to machine. It's anything getting data, right? And the identity of that.
And I mean, how many people here are using AI right now? Like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Ooh, we'll get to that. I got a good set of slides in here. But yeah, anything else on this one? So gap one, third-party risk management stops at assessment. You need to be active while you do business. Gap two is bring your Zero Trust strategy to the content layer, not just the applications and workloads. And gap three is digital rights management. I think this is an oldie but a goodie. So remember Napster? Not DRM. I remember when Napster, I think it was 21 or something, and I thought the world had opened up to me. It was the greatest thing that had ever happened. But
it did for like 90 days.
Yeah, for 90 days. But the world got smart. Microsoft and everybody started releasing digital rights management on this audio and then this video, et cetera. But it evolved into digital rights management for content as well, about 20 years ago. And so just according to Gartner, digital rights management for the entity, the enterprise, offers persistent data-centric defense, solving security and compliance challenges with clear goals and governance. Security and risk management technical professionals should follow this. They put an E, enterprise digital rights management framework, when building the case to design, implement, and operate. So I talk about DRM now because of compliance, everything's becoming data centric. So you have to start to look at, in order to get control of your data back, what are the digital rights management you can put on that data? So when you stop doing business with them, the data becomes useless, essentially. And in order to do that, there's three things that need to be considered. One is a cryptographic element. So the information, the data needs to be encrypted with it, so that no matter where it goes or rests, it's encrypted. Then identity element, users must be authenticated, match policies in order to access the data. And then granular usage control. So back to the control, users are granted specific rights within applications. So I'm just following along with Gartner here. Feel like I'm picking on Gartner. They're great, but it's just, I'll skip this slide for time. But the gap and the reason why DRM hasn't taken off is because it's brutal to implement and causes tremendous pain by most end users. So this part where a cryptographic element, information is encrypted so that protection travels with data no matter where it moves or rests. Historically, that's been accomplished primarily as an agent-based DRM. So, okay, if you want to apply digital rights management internally. You got to put agents on all of the endpoints within your company. That's painful enough. But imagine now the third-party ecosystem. Your vendors aren't going to put your agents on their laptops and things like that. Maybe some will if you have a really close relationship. But scaling that is impossible. And often the functionality breaks because it's technology. The authorization breaks, whatever. And so shadow IT appears and people start using Google Drive to share information, right? And also, your file still leaves your network in this model. It goes to that endpoint on the third party, and it's there. Which, if it's high risk, you really don't want it leaving. So that's another gap. It's like, how do you solve for a historically an antiquated approach to digital rights management in a compliance era where they're requiring you to manage your digital assets? The three gaps. Let's go on to the solution. So Kiteworks comes in. Our company has been around for 22 years, and it's been in the last 4 or 5 where we've gotten real speed in terms of adoption by the customer base. Our growth has been great over the past few years. And we've historically been known as a secure file transfer company, but our CEO, Jonathan Yaron, 6 years ago, started to do something where he started to bring in all the communication channels that data could move in and out of a company. So if we think about a company, you've got your repositories where this content sits, right? Box, SharePoint, SAP, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those have private content, health records, contracts, employment records, statements, all the stuff that regulators want you to protect, track, and control. And on top of that, all that different PII, IP, PHI, et cetera, in all these different repositories is moving out of your organization through different channels. File sharing, managed file transfer, web forms, APIs, email. I know I kind of made it scary at the beginning, but this really makes it scary in terms of how do I track and control all of this information? And it's all moving across the public internet, and it's moving to this massive dearth of vendor relationships, suppliers, accountants, employers, employees, government, et cetera. And it's just a noodle soup, I guess. You know, you got disparate systems. There's hardly any tracking, hardly any control. The security is weak, and it just needed to be solved. And so this is when Jonathan, our CEO, we started doing some tuck-in acquisitions, and we've created what we call a private content network, or PCN, which unifies all of those communication systems, tracks all the data that moves in and out of them, controls all the data that moves out in and out of them, in this communication ecosystem that we have for private information. So what that looks like is this. File sharing, the Kiteworks platform has file sharing, managed file transfer, web forms, API, and email all in one. So if you send a sensitive piece of content through a file sharing system to an end user, or through a managed file transfer, or through email using the Kiteworks platform, it's tracked. Secondly, any policies that you put on the content layer, no matter how that gets sent, it's applied, so it's controlled. And third, all of the end users are onboarded. So third-party ecosystem suppliers are onboarded into the platform. So the exchange of all of these, whether person or machine, is within this private content network. And what it does is it abstracts out all of this sensitive data from the public domain of the public internet, and you have the ability to track all of it. So our customers plug our platform into their SIM and get a detailed view of all of their policy-driven private content moving into their third-party ecosystem. Whether it's going through file share or emails, it's all normalized, and you get control. So if you set a policy on this piece of asset for this external user, and that asset goes through any of these channels, that policy will apply, and the policy will trigger actions like protect with DRM, don't view only, can't download, those types of policies. So you get this complete orchestration in the compliance era. So if a regulator comes and says, show me where all your PHI went, who had access to it, when did they have access to it? Our system can report on that. And then further, go ahead.
So in this, just my own understanding, you take that classification of data that would be set up, and then that helps with almost like a DLP of what would be. I don't know what color that is.
The teal.
Outside.
Yeah.
Into the purple.
Yeah. So we plug into DLP systems, classification engines like Titus, Microsoft has classification engines, and then we have classification, small business organizations that don't have those tools can classify within our system based on folders and users and things like that.
So it makes sense with all your files, but what about people typing things in the forums and this problem with like AI, like ChatGPT and things like that? Really copy sensitive data out of a Word document and then paste it into that. For files, I get it, but how about things like that? Just typing things in the website.
Great question. I got a set of slides on that. That actually question didn't really come up until AI. Like we didn't hear it very often. Well, what about copy paste? And look, everything you do from a compliance and a security standpoint is about lowering risk to the absolute bottom threshold. There will always be a way. This is always will. So take a picture of it. It's like, but if you're a professional and you've done everything you can to lower the risk, and you say, well, but the guy took a picture, I can't, you've lowered the risk, right? And that's what we're trying to give to companies is like, this tool takes your risk threshold lower, or your risk, the volatility of your risk lower, or this technology. So this is the answer to your question, and it's the solutioning of the DRM issue. So let's say we're in Kiteworks, the content repositories are connected to Kiteworks, it's moving to employees and third parties. You've got only this employee or this third party allowed, these other ones outside are not. Right now we have in pilot, in beta with several customers, something we call Safe Edit. So it's our next gen DRM. And what it does is it streams an editable instance of the data to the end user. So the piece of content never actually leaves the repository in your network. A video of it goes to the end user and they can edit it just like they normally would, but you can't copy and paste and you can't download it. You could take a picture if you wanted to, but even then you can add watermarks. We can have watermarks on our system. So this answers the problem of scalability, because you don't need to put agents on end user devices. So, and you can revoke access immediately. So your highest critical data, if you stop doing business and the policy is a safe edit on this asset, and you stop doing business with the company, you can turn off that access and instantly they no longer have the data itself. It really is a revolution in this concept of DRM, and it's probably the closest you could get from balancing productivity within your third party and protecting your data at all costs. Yeah.
So what sort of tools are available to those third parties in order to, right? Not something in Excel and edit it there, or is some tool limited to whatever?
It's right now we're launching the Microsoft suite because 80% to 90% of our customers are asking for the Microsoft suite. But from a user, you just get the file, which actually is just a link to the video stream. It opens up and it looks like you've opened a Word doc. It looks like you've opened an Excel doc. It looks like you've opened a PowerPoint. And you just start editing it like you would normally in Excel, but you're actually editing a video.
We're having customers,
It's
needing CAD files, right?
It's another one.
Bread and butter, manufacturing corporations, biotech, pharma, all of them. And we're getting into different file formats in line form. But just think of, as like Tim said, you're not sharing data anymore. The future is not send me this file. It's allow me to come in. and view this file. Allow me to come in
The
and
stream.
edit this file, this stream. And then when it's just a virtual desktop that pops up. And as soon as you close that document, that virtual machine, in your Kiteworks vault within your organization shuts down, and the documents put back in the repository that if you had access to it, you changed, and it's like nothing happened.
This is the last mile of
I'm sorry.
basically data protection in this ecosystem.
Somebody was online, asking if you could, repeat the, CAD data question.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. So manufacturers, intellectual property, it's the number one thing that they need to protect. I mean, obviously any sort of PII, but their businesses collapse if you lose your IP. It just does. So, we're in conversations. We have many major customers who are in our Kiteworks labs using this right now, but we have some that do business with China, and where they cannot get their data to move into these highly regulated countries. In this case, it doesn't. The file itself opens up in your network, in your server, in a virtual desktop instance, and what's streamed is a video of the file itself, an editable video, right? Encrypted. Normal protections apply, encryption, controls, and tracking. So the video of the file actually streams to the end user, not the file, not the content itself. They never get the content.
So if they're editing a spreadsheet, they'll edit the video of it, and then their actions of edits get transferred over.
Real time. And for CAD files, this is very important because manufacturers will have CAD designers all over the world, but they really can't afford to have this IP moving all over the world. Sure. Right?
It's one-sided file sharing, so to speak.
Basically.
So even though the user in that country can see the data on the screen in front of them. The data is. Do you win this argument with regulators saying, oh, well, we never actually sent them the data? Like,
well, no, you have to, if you have to apply a policy if the regulation says you can't share it to a country or whatever, when you can apply that policy. But any countries that you're okay to do business with are fine. You just don't.
The example you just gave of somebody working in China.
Yeah, that's not a regulatory. They just don't want to lose their IP.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an example of that.
You guys want, we could always show you guys more in depth demos later. Just reach out to us. It's really mind blowing.
But just when you thought it was safe to go back in the pool. Artificial intelligence. You knew I'd get to it. So, to your point, AI is just another machine where data can go. We now have another machine where data can go, right? And in the past couple months, the problem is just exploding. So probably heard of Samsung dropping trade secrets into ChatGPT. The articles keep going here. This came out of DEF CON. I mean, they're just breaking the crap out of all of these AI models right now. And Gartner just released a survey that intellectual property, data privacy, and cybersecurity. So 2 of the 3 things I've been talking about this whole time are the 3 threats that need to be addressed quickly by companies. Because what's happening? Back to that diagram. You've got corporate repositories, you've got sensitive data moving to employees and third parties, and they're putting them in large language models. They're moving them into machines, and they're doing it in 3 ways. There's a large language model has 3 sets of data. Training data, which is generally what they do at the beginning of creating these petabytes of data, training the large language model. As we all know, ChatGPT is under a lot of scrutiny right now for where they got that. There's a knowledge base. Now you can start to point LLMs to separate databases. So even at my company, I'm in marketing, so I don't really have anything that's sensitive, but we have custom tailored large language models that we have pointed at 100 PDFs of marketing material so that the sales organization and the channel organization can ask questions and get the real. So there's a knowledge base that you can point large language models at that people are stuffing sensitive data into. And then just the interface itself, right? To your point, they're copying and pasting and putting it right into the prompt. You can now upload files to most of these. So this is quickly becoming one of the most critical threat vectors and the biggest Wild West scenario for any corporation. And when it comes to compliance, again, regulators don't care that it went into a large language model. And so companies have to do something about it. So why is it becoming a real big deal? Well, we've all heard of ChatGPT, but man, there are a lot of large language models. Vacuna is something that came out of Stanford that's got 7 billion parameters. Meta just released Llama 2, obviously the Facebook parent company. That's open source. Anthropic, which is former founders of GPT, released Claude 2. There's now something called Hugging Face, which you can take all these open source models and build your own chatbots. Falcon, Mosaic was just bought by Darktrace for $3.5 billion. They don't have a penny of revenue, but they have a large language model that's trained on like 70 billion parameters. And of course, we all know Google Bard. I put probably the most well-known, but there are now hundreds of these. And also, if you go to the dark web, they're taking these large language models and they're building bad ones. So there's fraud GPT you can get, which basically helps you build attacks. There's poison GPT, which you can use to actually introduce malicious code into LLMs from the front end. And then there's Worm GPT, which has no ethics. You can ask it how to build a Molotov cocktail and mix that with some nuclear bombs, and it will tell you. You really don't want your content getting into these things. So controlling this at the data layer in an era of AI, I know I was talking about the compliance era, but now in the era of AI, everyone is trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And it just comes down to the simple thing that I talked about before. There's a lack of content-based risk policies. So get your content together, create policies on that content, and then protect it based on the sensitivity of that content. So we kind of talk about it in 3 layers with Kiteworks. The first one is, least you could do is make sure that only the right people have access to the content itself, and it's not open to anyone with access to the applications. So what we call least privilege access to the content itself, right? The next thing you can do is watermark it so that this subset of trusted people that know that this data is not for AI consumption. All right. So you've already taken it from what is the general best practice right now, which is educate all your employees. So yes, educate all your employees. Now make sure only the right ones have access to the content, and make sure they know which content should never go into large language models. So that's kind of like lower risk management. But as you can imagine, even the most trusted of employees could still take it and put it into these large language models. So within our system, we say for the next level of high risk content, make it view only. So they can't download it, right? Obviously that impedes a little bit of productivity if there needs to be collaboration on it, but there will be a subset of information that you just need to communicate that doesn't need to be edited. And if you really want to lock it down, you can apply the view only policy and that they can't download it. And then finally, which is the next gen DRM, for your really high risk content, your IP, your most sensitive PHI, where you need to collaborate with your information ecosystem, use next gen DRM. So you're actually never giving them the asset itself. They can't download it and they can't copy and paste it. And you've done everything you possibly can, short of burning their cell phone so they can't take a picture of it, from getting into the large language models. And that's really what we're talking to our customer base now is, think about the AI large language models as just another machine. And the same criteria that you would not want your content to get into any machine, you really need to pay attention to it from getting into AI. So least privilege access as a must to subsets of your most sensitive data, view only for stuff you don't want to get downloaded, and next gen DRM for those that what you need to collaborate on and is your most sensitive information. So that before I go into recap, that's our position for what's happening in the AI universe right now. And again, people aren't really downloading the normal employee, the normal third-party information supply chain, human being or machine isn't taking an entire database. They're taking files, they're taking content, and they're dumping it in. So companies really need to take that seriously.
How are we handling email attachments?
Our system handles email too. So when you send emails, the attachments, whatever the policy is, will be applied to the attachment.
Places that the stuff.
Yep. And same with MFT, anything that's automated that calls the same policy real time.
So if you're affected with ransomware and they're trying to exfiltrate data, deal with that.
If the Kiteworks is infiltrated with ransomware,
So no, we have kind of goes to basically VPN for data, right? We have that actor in our environment, which deploys ransomware and it's trying to exfiltrate data. How are you seeing that? So
we actually interface with ransomware technologies to protect. Is that what you're asking for? We're not a ransomware protection organization like our.
no, see, how to keep the data from going out. If ransomware been exfiltrated, how can fully not exfiltrated? You know, I mean, go to whatever cloud website or AI, whatever, try to upload data.
You should probably get better privacy policies. It's one of those things that probably is past the scope, right? Just full disclosure, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to lower the risk as much as possible, but if you have a bad employee that you've given privileged access to this subset of content, revoking privileges, you know.
Yeah, and I think with ransomware, it's probably going to start with a compromised account.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to affect our employees, like, the bad guys get data out so easily, and trying to think what's do those scenarios.
Sure. It's something we could take up also with our SEs.
I was gonna say, people use these large language models at AI, not because they like don't do that much to the internet. They use them because they add kids a value add. to
Yeah.
both their work satisfaction and their productivity. And putting these, this sort of the same thing where very onerous controls on doing your job, where you potentially reduce your user satisfaction. And same thing in transfer. That's have you worked on how people can integrate with models, get the value add they want out of it, and still use it in a secure manner? I mean, you touched some of my, what most companies do, but without a technical solution.
Sure.
Adding policy to define what can be, what can't be in correct cases. But how do you get to this point where you're actually increasing productivity and making increasing user satisfaction
With the AI model? Or
I'm
just
using AI as an example, because people use this because it adds value to their job. They're using these tools because they're either more productive or it increases the quality of their output.
Yeah.
If you inhibit that considering the development.
Sure.
And I'm just saying, how can we work on developing, integrating and this is a bigger question than just
Open for discussion. Sure.
how do you work with integrating with such modeling so that people can use them and still get a value add while protecting the data?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's the genesis of the safe edit and why nobody ever used DRM historically, right? Is that it doesn't work. Like it just breaks on the agent side. You have usability issues and it just bubbles up all this shadow IT. If you remove all that and you still deliver an exact seamless editing experience, which, the way people work is they edit things. That's it. From a content standpoint. If you don't need to edit, you just need to look at it. That's not going to interfere with your workflow. That's an easy one. So that we've essentially introduced the way to not impede productivity, but secure the content. And we kind of fell backwards into this AI use case, to be honest. Like a few weeks ago, we just looked at it and said, AI is just another machine that ingests data.
The Excel nutrition.
Yeah.
It's just like dumping on Facebook, but you know, people are using this for, you know, it's like sending a file to your friend to get feedback. So
Yeah, you don't want to do that if it's really sensitive, right?
but you know, that's people work by collaboration. I'm just gonna go, how do you make this you know, I can't take information out of the system because it's locked out. How do I do my job in a way that's simple? Because people are using these tools to actually be more productive.
Yeah.
Get more job satisfaction. Increase the work quality.
Yeah. And if you think about the AI side of it, you know, what you're protecting from are people that just don't know any better. You know, and when you start doing business with hundreds of people or hundreds of companies, you have a magnifying effect of people that just don't know any better. And you have to protect against that, right? And again, it's the same narrative we have, just now there's a new machine, right?
So just following up on the question about ChatGPT, I just saw an announcement, I don't remember the product name, but it's like privacy AI or something like that. And it's intended to be a layer in front of the AI that scrubs sensitive data out of new prompts.
Yeah.
So that may be a tool that would address the use case he's talking about, where you still enable your employees to use very useful tools like ChatGPT, but reduce the risk of, you know, them either intentionally or unintentionally leaking sensitive information into a tool like that.
Yeah, you should layer up. There's stuff, the DLP ones, the DLP providers are coming out with prompt DLP, which redacts sensitive information from the, like if we go back to the model from the chat interface part, but it's only when you're in your network. If you go home or if you use another computer, or you know, it doesn't work.
But do you guys have anything in your roadmap where you could say, if this is a trusted channel that Kiteworks will let data through, because we, the client, the customer, have said we've added additional controls to filter out data before it ends up in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if there's an AI, we can connect to it and provide that filtering. And all of these large language models have AI or APIs on them. So again, it's interesting because it is just another machine, and all machines have APIs. And we're the broker on API to API in thousands of machines across the world. So it depends on how sophisticated you want to get, but most companies are just struggling with, how do I get these people that just don't know any better to stop, you know?
So in the direction he was just talking about, this, what you're describing here, I can see massive use for. Because it lets you keep flows going and things like that, keeps discussion going. If you wanted the company to go the other direction, simplify it, there are versions of the chat that are for enterprises that scrub, like not that it's like my own, but enterprise main chat is basically ChatGPT 4, but it desensitizes on the way out and does not keep a history. You encapsulate an environment, say you throw a document in that you're working on, it keeps that all from recording what you're doing, which is the number one problem with ChatGPT, by the way. It keeps things forever. You know? It doesn't learn off of it, things like that. It just goes directly into the simplification. Long term, I will tell you that I've used things I do outside of Microsoft. I'm a heavy Jasper user. And that history is insanely valuable for letting me get through things. And the idea that I can have an AI start utilizing my own voice in its responses. Like changing the way it writes to match the way I write, that type of thing. I could see that for something like this being incredibly valuable just for safety. But you have both sides, but just also don't, one other thing. Large language models people are not the only AIs you have to worry about.
Yeah, yes, this is very true. Yep, and it's just expand. So that's why we always say, it doesn't matter the machine, it doesn't matter the person. If you have the policy on the content itself, then you're doing everything you can to lower the risk of it going to where you don't want it to go. And to your point, like even Azure launched today, I think, an enterprise AI LLM based on ChatGPT that's sort of ring fences your data. And so companies that want to leverage large language models for efficiency and productivity gains can use that and not worry, which they should. You still got tens of thousands of people in your supply chain, and they will still do this.
It's protecting inside.
Yeah, it's just
Which is what you're pointing out up there is going outside.
outside.
There are some controls, but it's not. I like this style.
So just to recap, and then I'm done. We're in a compliance era. Data is everywhere, and so should compliance controls, tracking, and reporting. There are 3 gaps that need to be addressed: zero trust, third party, and an antiquated approach to DRM. And that data and privacy protection and compliance has a new vector to be addressed, which is AI. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity and workshopping that a little bit with you guys. It helps me every time.
If anybody would be interested, same for everybody online, and maybe us coordinating some sort of demo of this to kind of get it in this. Shoot us an email, ISACA@sandiego@gmail.com, and definitely love to help play it.
And I think a recording and the deck will be available on your site, you said?
Yeah, actually, somebody had asked about that on the online questions as well. We'll have a slide there.
I thought we're getting that. So I thought part of the favor.
No. We lead you along. Next stage demo, next.
Baby step.
Yeah.
No, we try and keep them, just kind of educational and principle in nature. And then, but for the solution they provide, it is so unique that it's inevitable. We start talking about it.
What is the thing else? Right.